But he got right into another cab," added the driver. "It was just a chance I seen him, 'cause he made as if he was going into the Fifth Avenue. But luck was agin him, for I'd scarcely gone 2 blocks back when I had to get down to fix my harness. And while I was doing that, who should I see but my fare go by in another cab." "You did not happen to know the driver of that vehicle?" suggested Mr. Barnes. "That's just what I did happen to know. He's always by the square, along the curb by the park. His name's Jerry. You'll find him easy enough, and he'll tell you where he took that fly bird." Mr. Barnes went downtown again, and did find Jerry, who remembered driving a man at that stated time as far as the Imperial Hotel, but beyond that the detective learned nothing, for at the hotel no one knew Mr. Mitchell, and none recollected his arrival early Friday morning. From the fact that Mr. Mitchell had changed cabs and doubled on his track, Mr. Barnes concluded that he was after all merely hiding away for the pleasure of baffling him, and he felt much relieved to divest the case of its alarming aspect. However, he was not long permitted to hold this opinion. At the telegraph office he found a cable dispatch awaiting him, which read as follows: "Montezuma emerald forwarded Mitchell the 10th. Previous owner murdered. London 11th. Mexican suspected. Warned Mitchell." This assuredly looked very serious. Casting aside all thought of a practical joke, Mr. Barnes now threw himself heart and soul into the task of finding Mitchell, dead or alive. From the telegraph office he hastened to the custom house, where he learned that an emerald, the invoiced value of which was no less than $20,000, had been delivered to Mr. Mitchell in person upon payment of the custom duties at noon of the previous Thursday. Mr. Barnes, with this knowledge, thought he knew why Mr. Mitchell had been careful to have a friend accompany him to his home on that night. But why had he gone out again? Perhaps he felt safer at a hotel than at home, and having reached the Imperial, taking 2 cabs to mystify the villain who might be tracking him, he might have registered under an alias. What a fool he had been not to examine the registry, as he could certainly recognize Mr. Mitchell's handwriting, though the name signed would of course be a false one. Back, therefore, he hastened to the Imperial, where, however, his search for familiar chirography was fruitless. Then an idea occurred to him. Mr. Mitchell was so shrewd that it would not be unlikely that, meditating a disappearance to baffle the men on his track, he had registered at the hotel several days prior to his permanently stopping there. Turning the page over, Mr. Barnes still failed to find what he sought, but a curious name caught his eye: Miguel Palma, City of Mexico. Could this be the London murderer? Was this the suspected Mexican? Well, if so, here was a bold and therefore dangerous criminal, who openly put up at one of the most prominent hostelries. Mr. Barnes was turning this over in his mind, when a diminutive newsboy rushed into the corridor, shouting, "Extra, son! Extra, son! All about the horrible murder! Extra!" Mr. Barnes purchased a paper and was stupefied at the headlines: "Robert Leroy Mitchell drowned. His body found floating in the East River. A dagger in his back. Indicates murder." Mr. Barnes rushed out of the hotel, and quickly finding a cab, instructed the man to drive rapidly to the morgue. On the way he read the details of the crime as recounted in the newspaper. From this he gathered that the body had been discovered early in the morning by 2 boatmen, who towed it to shore and handed it over to the police. An examination at the morgue had established the identity by letters found on the corpse, and the initials marked on the clothing. Mr. Barnes was sad at heart, and inwardly fretted because his friend had not asked his aid when in danger. Jumping from the cab, almost before it had fully stopped in front of the morgue, he stumbled and nearly fell over a decrepit-looking beggar, upon whose breast was a printed card soliciting alms for the blind. Mr. Barnes dropped a coin, a silver quarter, into his outstretched palm, and hurried into the building. As he did so, he was jostled by a tall man who was coming out, and who seemed to have lost his temper. as he muttered an imprecation under his breath in Spanish. As the detective's keen ear noted the foreign tongue, an idea occurred to him which made him turn and follow the stranger. When he reached the street again, he received a double surprise. The stranger had already signaled the cab which Mr. Barnes had just left, and was entering it, so that he had only a moment in which to observe him. Then the door was slammed, and the driver whipped up his horses and drove rapidly away. At the same moment the blind beggar jumped up and ran in the direction taken by the cab. Mr. Barnes watched them both till both cab and beggar disappeared around the next corner, and then he went into the building again, deeply thinking over the episode. He found the morgue keeper and was taken to the corpse. He recognized the clothing at once, both from the description given by Williams and because he now remembered to have seen Mr. Mitchell so dressed. It was evident that the body had been in the water for several days, and the marks of violence plainly pointed to murder. Still sticking in the back was a curious dagger of foreign make, the handle projecting between the shoulders. The blow must have been a powerful stroke, for the blade was so tightly wedged in the bones of the spine that it resisted ordinary efforts to withdraw it. Moreover, the condition of the head showed that a crime had been committed, for the skull and face had been beaten into a pulpy mass with some heavy instrument. Mr. Barnes turned away from the sickening sight to examine the letters found upon the corpse. One of these bore the Paris postmark, and he was allowed to read it. It was from the jeweler's, and was the letter alluded to in the warning cable. Its contents were: Dear Sir, as we have previously advised you, the Montezuma emerald was shipped to you on the 10th instant. On the following day, the man from whom we had bought it was found dead in Dover Street, London, killed by a dagger thrust between the shoulders. The meagre accounts telegraphed to the paper here state that there is no clue to the assassin. We were struck by the name, and remembered that the deceased had urged us to buy the emerald, because, as he declared, he feared that a man had followed him from Mexico, intending to murder him to get possession of it. Within an hour of reading the newspaper story, a gentlemanly-looking man, giving the name of Miguel Palma, entered our store and asked if we had purchased the Montezuma emerald. We replied negatively, and he smiled and left. We notified the police, but they have not yet been able to find this man. We deemed it our duty to warn you, and did so by cable. The signature was that of the firm from which Mr. Barnes had received the cable in the morning. The plot seemed plain enough now. After a fruitless murder of the man in London, the Mexican had traced the emerald to Mr. Mitchell, and had followed it across the water. Had he succeeded in obtaining it? Among the things found on the corpse was an empty jewel case bearing the name of the Paris firm. It seemed from this that the gem had been stolen. But if so, this man Miguel Palma must be made to explain his knowledge of the affair. Once more visiting the Imperial, Mr. Barnes made inquiry, and was told that Mr. Palmer had left the hotel on the night of the previous Thursday, which was just a few hours before Mr. Mitchell had undoubtedly reached there alive. Could it be that the man at the morgue had been he? If so, why was he visiting that place to view the body of his victim? This was a problem over which Mr. Barnes puzzled as he was driven up to the residence of Mr. Mitchell. Here he found Williams, and imparted to that faithful servant the news of his master's death, and then inquired for the address of the family abroad, that he might notify them by cable before they could read the bald statement in a newspaper. "As they only sailed a week ago to-day," said Williams, "they're hardly more than due in London. I'll go up to the master's desk and get the address of his London bankers." As Williams turned to leave the room, he started back amazed at the sound of a bell. "That's the master's bell, Inspector. Someone is in his room. Come with me." The two men bounded upstairs, 2 steps at a time, and Williams threw open the door of Mr. Mitchell's boudoir, and then fell back against Mr. Barnes, crying, "The master himself!